All right, thank you all for joining us. This is going to be a conversation about Dr. George Washington Coffey. It's titled Grassroots History in the Story of Dr. Coffey. I am joined today by three people who are going to talk a little bit about the different aspects that they brought to this project. So first, I'd like to introduce Chari Bostick. Chari is a native of Gadsden, Alabama. She's a proud graduate of Gadsden State Community College and Jacksonville State University. Former board member of Habitat for Humanity, chair of Minority Affairs for Democratic Executive Committee in Gadsden, SELC member, and NAACP member. She has served as the executive director of Grace Heritage Community Development since 2013. Grace Heritage operates Southern Hills Cemetery, which is the first African-American cemetery in Gadsden, as well as the African-American Museum of Gadsden. Thank you for being here, Chari.
It's great to be here.
Next, we are joined by Kristina Mullenix, who is a first-year PhD student in history at the University of Alabama. Kristina holds a bachelor's degree in history from Mount Mary University and a MLIS with a specialty in archives management from Indiana University. Her research interests include uncovering the experiences and histories of enslaved people in Alabama, history's power to nurture healing in communities, interconnecting links between history, community, education, and social justice. Her other interests include public history, oral history, genealogy, and Alabama history. And Kristina has kind of really put a lot of the parts of this project together. So thank you for doing all that, Kristina. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And we also have Mr. Lee Freeman. Lee is a Lauderdale County native who attended both Wilson High School and the University of North Alabama. Lee has been a local historian at the Florence-Lauderdale Public Library since 1997. He is a member of several local historical preservation boards, including his Heritage Preservation Incorporated, Natchez Trace Genealogical Society, North Alabama Civil War Roundtable, Tennessee Valley Historical Society. Lee has articles published in Alabama Heritage and the Journal of Muscle Shoals History. Is currently researching a biography on Thomas Marion or Mountain Tom Clark. Lee, it's always a pleasure to have you and to speak with you and have you share your expertise on all matters relating to Florence history and Alabama history as well.
As Minnie Pearl would say, I'm just so proud to be here.
Okay, so
cool being here.
I'm glad that y'all were able to join us today. And so I'm going to kind of start this off by letting Kristina introduce some of the things that she's been working on and the research that she's kind of uncovered and to take us where this project has gone. Because I know that this has kind of has gone in a lot of different directions and has brought in a lot of different people, and so can kind of be a model of doing this sort of grassroots history and involving a lot of different people in different places. So Kristina, would you like to start off?
Sure. I just want to preface it by saying that no project is ever complete. And, there's definitely still questions about the story of Dr. Coffey that we're all still working on. I won't relay all the details just for time's sake, but basically it kind of came about by accident. I came across a picture that led me to uncover George Washington Coffey and want to try to figure out why he left Florence. A lot of the research that I did just formed the framework of his life, but then it was, reaching out to Chari and to Lee and to you, Brian, that kind of helped fill in the gaps. So just the basics of his story is that he was born in Florence, 1872. He was the son of formerly enslaved parents, Washington Coffey and Sally McVeigh. And what we see through his story is that he really sought higher education and sought to remove himself from the box that white society put him in. So he ventured out to Howard University, where he got a medical degree and also later dental surgery degree. Then we see him go to Denver, Colorado, 1904 to 1906. City directories show that he shared space with Dr. Justina Ford, who was also the first African-American doctor in Denver. And then he made his way back to Florence in 1906, was there for a short period of time, and then suddenly vanished. And I was trying to think about the process. Like my first thing was to find him in census records, city directories, and found him in Gadsden, Alabama, on census records. And that's where he set up his medical practice and lived until he died in 1952. But what's interesting about his story, and that makes it important, I think, is that we kind of see him getting involved in different activities that probably lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement. There's a lot of information about race. For example, in Florence, he was in a very segregated environment. His parents were enslaved at John Coffey's plantation called Hickory Hill. And then you see the white Coffeys and you see the black Coffeys. And what's interesting is they spell their names differently. And so there's that environment. We've got, there are lynchings going on and a lot of different violent activities. When he went to Howard, we don't know for sure, but he possibly interned at hospital that a lot of the medical students interned at. The Freeman's Hospital is what it was called at the time. And that was a hospital that treated people from all races. So we can imagine that he may have had that experience. There was also a lot of students that were from China and Korea during the time when he was there. So we can imagine that he, not only being in Washington, D.C. in a totally different environment than Florence, but suddenly surrounded by people from different walks of life, different ethnicities, that perhaps that colored his experiences. And then there were also a few white students that attended Howard, although that changed as segregation increased. And then in Denver, it still was a very segregated environment. Doctors could not practice at hospitals, so they typically practiced out of their homes. And if he did work with Dr. Ford, she was known to treat patients from various different ethnicities. There were a lot of immigrant people in Denver at the time, and she was known to learn other languages so that she could work with them. So we can imagine that he had that experience where he was starting to put together that it was possible for people from different ethnicities, different backgrounds, even just Black and white, to work together in some sort of harmony. That it wasn't always that way, but I think that he probably had a chance to see that. And what's interesting is in Denver, his office was actually on the border of the area between what was known as the Wall Street area, that was more known as the white area, and the neighborhood that was called Five Points, which was the Harlem of the West. It was a thriving African-American neighborhood. And Chari later can maybe fill in some information about his neighborhood in Gadsden as far as the location. We see him getting involved in different activities where they're bringing in speakers from Howard University and other places where they're talking about race relations and what's happening in the community. He wrote a very eloquent article in Denver in the newspaper. It was actually at a literary society, but it was published in the Statesman newspaper. It was called The Descendants of Ham. And what he focused on was that he's writing about African history and relating it to the biblical story of Ham and how racism attempts to make African Americans feel like they don't have any history or any importance. And so in that article, he's laying out the argument that is true, that illustrates the important achievements of, for example, ancient Egypt and Ethiopia, with science and art and literature, but he's relating that to how in the short period of time after emancipation, African Americans made numerous accomplishments. And he has a bunch of different statistics. So it's just interesting to see how all that plays, lays the groundwork for his activities in Gadsden. And then what we know comes later as the civil rights movement. But it was really getting in touch with Chari, who knows the history of Gadsden and has worked to preserve it, and had already done an enormous amount of work on Dr. Coffey, found his office, and then talking with Lee and what he knows about the history of Florence, that really helped form the heart of Dr. Coffey's story, and also oral history. I was able to get in touch with a woman who was a student of Mrs. Coffey, Dr. Coffey's wife, Mamie Washington Coffey. And she only knew the story of Dr. Coffey and Mrs. Coffey from her elementary school time period. However, that also gives us a fuller picture of their life and the impact they had on their community.
Thank you, Kristina. That certainly is a lot to cover. I'm kind of interested in a couple of things that you mentioned, but how did you were sort of drawn to Dr. Coffey and his story? From all of the different possible research angles, was there something about him or his life or his story that kind of resonated with you?
Well, to be quite honest, the first thing that interests me is in my mom's side of the family, we are related to Coffeys. And so Pope's Tavern had posted a photo of Lawson Coffey, who was a USCT soldier during the Civil War. And so I wrote to Brian and said, tell me about Lawson. And come to find out, I stumbled across the story of Hickory Hill, which I had never heard of, to be honest. But I had heard of General John Coffey. And with my MLIS degree, I needed a history project. And I wanted to kill two birds with one stone. So I knew that there was the newspaper article where Dr. Coffey had went back to Florence and nobody knew where he went to. So I don't know, the investigative part of me wanted to see if I could figure out where did he go? What happened to Dr. Coffey? What's his story? There was something that interested me. And to be quite honest, it sounds a little bit crazy, but I think Dr. Coffey wants his story told. That's just my own personal opinion, but I think that, maybe from the beyond, he was putting bugs in all of our ears, to tell his story. So, and uncovering it, it's an amazing story. So there's a lot to learn.
It absolutely is an amazing story, and we're going to get into some of the kind of things that have been uncovered through this whole process a little bit later. But I think right now, to kind of get an understanding of coffee in Florence and what coffee means and who the Coffeys were, I'd like to ask Lee to kind of talk a little bit about the George Washington Coffey family, and kind of where they came from in Florence and what that means in our neck of the woods up here in Northwest Alabama.
Well, that's a very interesting and important question. And just before I move into George W. Coffey and the Coffey name, let me just back up a little bit and address something Kristina said a moment ago. I first came across Dr. Coffey when I was researching African-American physicians in Florence before 1933, when Dr. Leonard Jerry Hicks relocated here. He graduated from Harry and he did some other coursework, but he came here from Florida in 1933, and folk memory had him as the first professional African-American physician in Florence-Lauderdale. Actually, we had 9 before Dr. Hicks came here, and Dr. Coffey was one of those 9. And I was just blown away when I found out that I found a newspaper notice from the Florence Herald from I believe March of 1906, which I think we have in the queue somewhere, that noted that Dr. G.W. Coffey had set up a practice in Lauderdale County. He had just passed his medical license in Florence, and that he had been licensed by the county medical examiners, and he was able to set up a practice. And then just back in November of 1906, he relocated to Gadsden. I think it's number 6, Brian. Yeah, it said that he had been practicing in Denver for 2 years, and then in November, there's the African American community posted resolutions for him and an African American teacher that had relocated, and it just noted that I was able to figure out that Dr. Coffey went to Gadsden, but I didn't know much about him. So then I got interested in Dr. Coffey's parents, who were Washington and Sally McVeigh Coffey. And Washington Coffey was an enslaved person of General John Coffey, which is a pretty big deal in Northwest Alabama, in particular, Florence-Lauderdale. The Coffey High School, which was consolidated with Bradshaw High School to found Florence High School, was endowed by Camilla Coffey, Alexander Donaldson Coffey's wife, in 1916. Alexander Donaldson Coffey was the son of John Coffey. So Coffey High School was named after the two of them. Eliza Coffey Memorial Hospital was named after their daughter, Eliza Croon Coffey, who died as a young single woman at a very young age. So they endowed a hospital and named it after her. So the Coffey and there are still white Coffey descendants living now, and there are African-American Coffey descendants living here. So the general is a pretty big name. General John Coffey was the trustee of the Cypress Land Company that founded Florence in 1818. He was Surveyor General of the Alabama Territory. He was a hero of the War of 1812 and the Red Stick War. He was related to General Andrew Jackson, later President Andrew Jackson. John Coffey's wife, Mary Donaldson, was Rachel Donaldson Jackson's niece. So they had a family in-law connection. Coffey and Jackson were partners together. On at least 2 occasions, Coffey fought duels for Andrew Jackson. Now that's some friendship right there. I don't know any of my in-laws that would fight a duel for me, but he did. So they were pretty close as in-laws and as business partners. Well, by the time of his 1830 census enumeration, John Coffey had about 30 enslaved persons working his Hickory Hill plantation, which at the time was like 3 miles just north of Florence on what is now the Cloverdale Road, but was originally the Coffey Road. And so Wash was one of those enslaved persons. His name was probably George Washington Coffey, but they called him in most of the documents Washington or Wash. Washington was bequeathed in the general's 1834 will to the general's son, John D. Coffey Jr., who died not long after that. And I think, though I can't prove this, that Washington and perhaps his wife Sally and any enslaved children that may have been, well, I think all of their children were probably born after slavery, the ones we know about. But they were probably at some point the slaves of Alexander Donaldson Coffey, because after the war, Washington and Sally Coffey and their 17 kids, because they had about 17 kids between the late 1850s all the way up through 1893. They were living on Gunnelford Road, which was very close to the Ardoin plantation of Alexander Donaldson Coffey. So my theory is that probably Washington and Sally and many of their children are buried at the Ardoin Plantation Servant Cemetery on Gunnelford Road. But the Coffey name is a pretty big deal around here. And this all came up, our interest in the African-American Coffeys in particular came up when the Walmart on Cloverdale Road went in. They were building a new Walmart. And earlier they had tried to build a CVS or a Walgreens or CVS pharmacy, Walgreens pharmacy. And residents said, wait a minute, there's a slave cemetery right about where you're going to build that pharmacy. So we're not exactly sure where it is, but you better be careful. Well, it turns out it wasn't close enough to the Walgreens pharmacy to impact them building that. So about 5 or 6 years later, Walmart decided to build another store on Cloverdale Road, and the residents said, hey, wait a minute, there's a slave cemetery back there. So that really got us interested about those people. The walled white family Coffey cemetery had been maintained over the years by family members. And for 15 or 20 years, a class from Mars Hill Bible School, one of their teachers, they adopted a cemetery. So they would keep the weeds cut and kept everything looking nice. And then when that class was no longer able to do it, it kind of got grown up. And that African-American acre, which according to the deeds from 1902 and I think 1904, says there's 1 acre for a white cemetery and 1 acre for an African-American servant cemetery. There's only one partial stone, it's broken. So we have had a real difficult time trying to figure out what name is on the stone. Everybody else is unmarked. Approximately 140 odd people buried there, mostly unmarked. So that got us interested in, okay, let's try to find out who these people are, because that cemetery, the last burial probably was in the 1940s or 50s. As it is now, from their death records, we can document 12 people that we know are buried there. As I said, I don't think Wash Coffey is one of them. I think he's at the A.D. Coffey Cemetery. But that, was further impetus to try and research the enslaved persons on the general's plantation, which in his will, the children were bequeathed several numbers of slaves. Alexander Donaldson got most of them, but of the other children received slaves as bequests from his will as well. So we wanted to track them down and figure out what became of them. So that's a really long, involved answer. Maybe that answers Brian's question.
Yes, thank you very much for providing that background of Dr. Coffey's sort of where he's rooted in Florence and kind of the impetus for Florence to investigate some of the African-American Coffey descendants and people who were from here because of the cemetery, an uncovering of the cemetery and kind of upkeep of that space. So I'm wondering now, we've got this concept of Dr. Coffey and kind of coming from Florence and this sort of storied, almost mythical, legendary figure in Florence's history. And then he moves on and becomes a doctor in Gadsden, Alabama. And so, Chari, can you tell us a little bit about what we know about Dr. Coffey's life and practice in Gadsden, Alabama?
Sure. When I first learned about Dr. Coffey, it was from an older doctor here in Gadsden. We were trying to locate where his office space would have been in downtown Gadsden. Most of the Black business was pretty much relegated to the 600 block of Broad Street. And we wanted to see if those offices were actually up further than people had known them to be. So we went through a lot of the city directories and came up with a general location for where he was. And I went and spoke with Dr. Spencer Thomas, who was living at the time, and he said his office was there and you were able to access that office from the street, from Broad Street. We went and tried to find that office space and could not. And the Life of Alabama is who owns the building. And they had no idea where this space was. They were like, nope, you've got it wrong. You've got the address wrong. And so I went to Kay Moore, who runs downtown Gadsden, and told her that I was seeking to find this address for this practice, because it pretty much debunked some of history in Gadsden, showing that they did have Black business that was located in a part of Gadsden that pretty much was a a white business only district. And I wanted to view that office space. Well, we couldn't find it. So for a year and a half, we were just stuck on the space is not there. The space is not available to us anymore. So perhaps, the city directory could have been wrong, or, something that, that misspoke about where it actually was. Well, then Life of Alabama decided to renovate that building. And they contacted Kay Moore and told her, can you get in touch with the history lady that spoke to us about this address, because we think that we found her address. What happened was they peeled the roof off of the building to take an aerial photo of the building structure. And when they did, they found that there was a 4 office space there that they couldn't access from the inside of the building. They had no idea that that space even existed, other than my telling them that it was such an address. Well, they said, we're gonna try to get into this space. When they opened up the wall, they found that they had ripped out the staircase and dismantled the office spaces so that whites could not occupy an office space that Blacks had once occupied. So they bricked up every window, they bricked up the entranceway, and they ripped out the staircase so it could not be used. And it was that way for about 70 years. And you can walk from one end of that building to the other, not having known that that space was ever there, because they bricked that space up. So once we were able to get inside, I think you have some slides of the space inside. We were able to see the actual constructs of that space. And there were 4 doctors that were in this space, 2 dentists and 2 doctors, and Dr. Coffey being one of them. And he would come up those stairs every morning with his street shoes on. And once he got to the top of the staircase, he would stick his shoes in a cubby and change shoes for his office shoes. And those shoes were actually left inside that cubby when they put them out of that office space. And I was able to recover those shoes as well. But Dr. Coffey was a prominent doctor here in this town. He saw a lot of the African American community, but I found out that he also saw some of the ladies of the evening and treated them, whether they were white or Black, because the office space was right next to a drugstore. But right next to his office building was a hotel that attracted ladies of the evening, and they would use that office space, but they would also go to their office for treatment. There was an older lady so she said, I remember working at the sundries counter there as a child, and they would walk past that store on the corner to get to their space. She said, I remember that, but I also remember the cat calls from the ladies of the evening to gentlemen that were walking on the street as well. She said, so all of that was going on there. And she didn't really know what happened, other than they did not want the white population to use that building once they put them out of it. She said that's all she can remember about that space, is that she said we could not use a Black occupied space. So that's why it was bricked up. So she gave us that information to let us know that it became tainted in some way because they could not use that part of the building anymore. She said, but two of the doctors moved to the building right across the street and opened up a practice. And Dr. Coffey pretty much moved to the 600 block where most Black businesses were.
I think that's one of the most fascinating parts of the story is the rediscovery of his office space. Lee, you had something you wanted to share?
Yeah, that when Chari was speaking, that reminded me that we don't know exactly where Dr. Coffey's office in Florence was, but I was surprised to find out that, like she said of Gadsden, there were many African-American businesses between the end of the Civil War and the 1930s and 40s that were integrated downtown. People just always assumed that the Black businesses had been over on Florence's west side, which is the Black community where it is mostly centered nowadays. While there were some African-American businesses on South Corp Street, a lot of the businesses we have found were integrated, on Corp Street, East Mobile Street, Seminary Street. So that's just an interesting phenomena that we found when we began to research the African-American businesses of Florence. So I don't know exactly where Dr. Coffey's practice was for the 10 or so months that it was here, but it's just interesting that our situation was similar to Gadsden's, that you find African-American businesses sprinkled among the white ones during that time frame.
Kristina, I'm kind of curious, and you have been kind of researching and reaching out to different people, and what was it like for you to kind of come into contact with both Lee and Chari, who are also researching a little bit of this story, and then discovering this kind of history in Gadsden that helps to bring more of Dr. Coffey's story to light here in Florence and across the state?
It was like winning the lottery, to be quite honest. I realized there's only so much sometimes that you can uncover with records. You can read between the lines, especially with census records sometimes, and get a sense of neighborhoods. But I've never been to Florence. I've been to Gadsden, but we only went to Nakalula Falls. I've never been, I'm not familiar with the neighborhoods, with the history. And so I think it's key to tap into those other sources. And also what was also helpful because of that, in Florence, like I know that there are key people that are preserving the African-American history, and there seems to be a little bit more of that, but like with both Florence and Gadsden, besides the key people that are preserving it, there's very little secondary sources, I guess you'd say, especially with Gadsden. A lot of what I found was newspaper articles as far as documents go, besides the city directories and the census records. It's like the information is there, but it hasn't been consolidated. If anybody needs a book idea, write about the history of African Americans in Gadsden, African Americans in Florence, and relate them to the bigger society. I couldn't find those things. And that's what historians typically try to do, besides the evidence and the research, the historiography, that it just doesn't exist. And so tapping into Chari's knowledge, and she has resources that I don't have, the people that she's talked to, the older doctor that told her the story, all of those things that brought his story to life. And also the information and the wisdom that Lee has, that key information.
Yeah, it was like winning the lottery for me when Kristina said, no, I got a photo of this guy. And then when Chari says we got his shoes, I'm like, wow, we have hit the jackpot.
So Chari, what was this experience kind of like for you to realize that other people are researching Dr. Coffey, maybe from his hometown, and kind of putting some of these things together?
I had a lot of information on him. I didn't know, I guess, about his life in Florence, but I did have some records of him, knowing that he actually did come from Florence. I was able to speak to one of his wife's brothers. His name is George Washington, and he actually was able to give me some information on Mamie's life and their life here in Gadsden. They were in a part of town, they lived in a part of town that was taken through eminent domain. There was a large lawsuit about that community suing the city of Gadsden to try to keep their property. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court before they lost. And that community had to, if you owned your property, you had to pick your house up and physically move it to the other side of the tracks. Or if you didn't own your property, you had to move into what's known as affordable housing to have somewhere to stay. Dr. Coffey, Dr. Barnes, and several other men were named on this lawsuit as being part of the community that was trying to make sure that they had the right of first refusal. If they got to keep their property, they could pay a reasonable price for their property. And during this time, he did get involved in a lot of the precursors to the civil rights movement here because of some of the injustices that were going on. We found several newspaper articles and several church meeting rolls that show that he was involved in bringing some of the larger names for the African American community to Gadsden to have meetings with the African American community to let them know what was coming or what they needed to prepare for. And we went to a lot of those churches, and those churches just don't have the history, that the newspaper reported on. They just don't have that history because they either didn't know to keep that information or didn't find that it was relevant, or to think that maybe if someone came into our church, if we had this information, they probably harm the church or harm the members of the church. So they just didn't. African Americans historically did not keep very good documentation for those reasons. So a lot of the history that we have is pretty much oral history from family members or histories from the newspaper. But it has been awesome working with Kristina to find out all of the information from Florence and from Denver to give a more complete timeline of his life.
Just trying to keep up with Kristina. She's indefatigable. Is that the word? So she's
Absolutely.
gonna wear me out. But that's good. She's dogged and she's kept at it.
So I guess I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the process of sharing information and how historians and researchers in different parts of the state and the country can collaborate on an effort like this. So can you all just kind of quickly give us some insights about advice that you have or things that you have learned from kind of sharing this knowledge and working towards this research by learning about and by researching Dr. Coffey?
Well, they said in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, quoting Socrates, true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. So I'll get my geek on a little bit. So anytime I think, well, I know everything there is to know about a topic, no, I don't. Along comes Kristina Mullenix and says, hey, I'm researching this man named George W. Coffey. And I've got a little bit of documentation on him, but I'm looking for more. And she was able to fill in gaps. I knew he had come to Florence from Denver, or come back to Florence from Denver in 1906, but I had no idea about anything that he had done while in Denver, and nothing about when he was in Gadsden. So, this, reaching out and putting feelers out to other historians that can fill in the gaps. The more we talk to each other and can, help try to work on this together, I consider myself a small cog in a much larger wheel. So we really do get a lot more done working together and pooling our resources. We may discover resources that Gadsden has that we didn't know about. They may discover resources Florence has they didn't know about.
I've actually enjoyed working with Kristina and learning a lot of the information that Lee has, and along with Brian, and some of the history that we did not know. I have 4 other students that I'm currently working with, and none are in Alabama. So I am having to try to work with them across different forms of communication. I've had to learn how to do Dropbox and Zoom meetings, and to try to do video conferences to try to get that information to them. It has been interesting learning how they decided to settle on a subject in Gadsden, Alabama. That has always fascinated me. How in all the places in all the world you chose a person that is from here. And so, I've gotten different answers. Like I said, currently I have 4 students, but I've maybe had 14 over the course of the past 5 years, and enjoyed working with each and every one of them. And they bring a level of familiarity with their subject, but they're eager to learn that much more. And I found that with Kristina. She came to me and she's like, I'm trying to find this information, but I'm having problems with my source information. And I told her, I said, I guess every place that you'll go in Gadsden will always refer you to me, because I am the repository for most everything African American. And while I don't know everything, like Lee said, I like to learn. And for as much as I have researched most of the people in this community, there's always something that I can take from a project like this. So I have really enjoyed working with her, really enjoyed getting to know you guys. And I think that is very important that we reach across state lines sometimes, because we don't know everything. And there's just maybe one small aspect that could break open a gap that, I have had for years. I can have from life, from the beginning of his life to a certain point, like Lee has. He left Denver and came back to Florence. And then after that, you didn't know where he was. And then, a person such as myself would have from maybe 1910 to the rest of his life here in Gadsden. So to get a full scope or a full view of his life by, connecting those dots, connecting those people in different communities has it has brought a lot of, made his life a little bit more well-rounded. And we've gotten to know him as a person than a name on a piece of paper.
Yeah. Before he was a name, he was one of 17 children of George Washington Coffey and his wife, Sally McVeigh. But now he's a person who has a whole career from birth to death. And I love my job because I get to meet people like Kristina and Chari and swap information and swap stories. We commiserate with each other on some of the hurdles we have to face. And it's just cool when they bring something to the table, maybe I can bring something to the table. And then I get to work with Brian, who is currently chairman of our historical commission, who won't brag on himself, but they're doing a really great job overseeing our historic preservation efforts in Florence-Lauderdale.
I just want to echo what Lee and Chari both said. I think in reaching out to people that you don't know to try to find answers, you have to come from a place of humility, just as they both expressed very well. But you also have to be willing to share the information that you already have, in addition to knowing that you don't know it all. And I say that because I also do a lot of genealogy research. Not so much in history, but in genealogy, you see that often where people want more information, but they're not willing to share what they already have. And I am one of those people, I'll tell you everything I found if we can, because you might see something that I missed. Everybody has a different lens that they look through besides the gifts and the knowledge they have. So somebody else might see something or it might benefit them. And I really hope that we can tap into maybe the descendants of Dr. Coffey and Mrs. Coffey, because maybe there's something that all of us have found that they don't know, the oral history, the stories, or maybe they know a lot more and it might fill in the gaps that we have. So, yeah.
I think that's such an important sentiment. And at this, we come across this all the time as historians. We all know this. My first question is usually to Lee, and if I have any questions about anything at all. And, Lee has done a tremendous job of compiling that information so that people who are researching can access it. But there's still a lot of information that's out there that people might not think that's important. And, I know we've all had these moments of discovering something that somebody had that they didn't think was important. And we're like, wow, this is incredibly important to kind of telling this story. So I think it's kind of amazing that the people here kind of found each other in this way, because they're all, you could tell, very willing to share and very willing to learn and collaborate on this project. And when it all comes together like this, it's a very beautiful thing. And I know that as historians, getting to do this and getting to do this type of research is certainly one of the highlights of what we do. But I'm kind of also interested in hearing, kind of as we wrap up here, the story of George Washington Coffey on a regional and national level. Why is it important? Why is it important that we know this story? And what does this tell us about what's happening here during this time period? So I'll just start with Kristina and then go to Lee and then to Chari.
I think there's a lot of things, but one thing that comes to my mind that was interesting to uncover is that, he came from a place where he wasn't supposed to rise above this box that the society put him in, and he did anyway, and he went beyond it, and he reached back and tried to bring other people along with him. And we also see how he was trying to change his community for the better with the racism and the violence that was around him.
Yeah, that's very true. And I always say, and have said for many years, that if a community, and this goes for communities, people, groups, but if a community doesn't know where it's been, it won't have any idea where it's going. So I think it's vitally important that we study our history, the good, the bad, and indifferent, I guess, so that we get a full understanding of where we've been, so that we can correct the injustices of the past if possible. But just in a more personal way, just to give Dr. Coffey the honor that he deserves, because, this is kind of undiscovered history for Florence-Lauderdale. So, returning this undiscovered history that's, for whatever reason, has gotten kind of ignored or lost or forgotten, trying to give this back to the community, because as I've also always said, while in a very real sense, it is African-American history and it belongs to that community, the community of Dr. Coffey. It's also Florence-Lauderdale's shared history. It's our history. Everybody that lives here, in my opinion, should be proud of the achievements that Florence-Lauderdale's African-American community made, especially right after the Civil War. I mean, we could talk about the churches, schools, businesses, medical practices they founded. It would blow your mind, because it did mine. So, celebrating our shared heritage and giving these people the credit that they have, for whatever reason, over, the last several decades have not gotten, and just making this research available and then getting other people jazzed on it and plugged into it so they can add their contribution to it. I think it's very important.
And to, like I said, to make it a more well-rounded subject for people that are outside of the state that may not know of Dr. Coffey and his contributions that he gave to Florence, as well as Denver, as well as Gadsden. The smallest thing, like being on being in a small town, fighting all the way to the Supreme Court for an eminent domain case that ultimately affected the entire United States. Most people don't realize that eminent domain and affordable housing project started in Gadsden, Alabama, because Albert Raines was the senator that brought it to the Senate floor and argued for slum clearance in most states in the United States. It all started here in Gadsden. And for Dr. Coffey to be one of those persons fighting for his community, and it ended up being a much larger project or much larger scope once it was complete, for people to know that, his fight was not in vain, or the things that he brought to his community ultimately affected every African-American community in the United States, whether it be adverse or positive. You may not know him as a person, but it is clear that he made his mark in history, and everyone should know that he was part of bringing awareness to a dire situation as far as racism is concerned, to actually touch parts of the world that he probably never thought that he would have touched in the way in which he did.
Such important perspectives that you all have brought into this. And this has been such an excellent conversation. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this and see where this research has gone, and to see the different connections that are being made here. And I think this is such an important thing for people to understand and know about. And I just kind of want to go back to something that Lee said about people, from our community understanding that this happened, and that there were George Washington Coffeys of the world, and that they did exist. And you all kind of echo this sentiment as well. And it's so important for us to understand who these people were, what they fought for, and what they did on a national scale, like you were talking about, Chari. I'm just wondering, as we conclude, are there any final thoughts that y'all want to share before we conclude for the day?
It's a work in
I
progress.
would like to say, go ahead, Lee.
It's a work in progress. We've researched one of George Washington Coffey's 17 kids. Now we got 16 more to research. So Kristina, you want another project? No, probably not.
I'm already working on it, Lee.
Yeah, but why does that not surprise me? Yeah, it's a work in progress. The more I learn, the more I want to know. So, and I love my job. I'd almost do it for free, but don't tell the library board I got to eat and pay bills. So we'll keep working, and I'm thankful for venues like this where we can share the stories of these interesting historical figures and make them not just historical figures that lived a long time ago, but real, actual flesh and blood people.
I would just
Well-
echo that and say, support your local historians. Find out who are the people preserving the untold stories in your community and ask what you can do to support them.
And I would also just briefly say, anyone out there that views this, if you're a descendant of the Coffey family, I know there are some local descendants I've met once or twice. If any of them see this, please come in and talk to us. If they have photos or family documents, they'd share with us so we can round out this research. Anybody that has any information on Dr. Coffey that you want to share with any of us, please get in touch with us.
I'd like to say that any student that is researching any person, don't be afraid to reach out to historians. Don't be afraid to go beyond the city that you live in. Make sure that your research is well-rounded and balanced. Make sure that every aspect of your research is, the questions that you have are answered. Because once you get up to present to someone and, they ask you a question that you just don't know, that's what reaching out to Lee or Brian or Kristina have gotten us to the point that we are right now, because neither one of us knew the whole story until we were able to all come together and put our heads together and make this, a more well-rounded project. So don't be afraid to reach out to other historians.
Yeah, it's okay to say, I don't know, let me research that and get back to you. Nothing
Absolutely.
wrong with that.
Now, Lee, we will tell you, Kristina and I have given her a couple of other siblings that he actually brought to Gadsden to live,
Okay.
along with he did have a child and a grandchild that could be added to your family tree as well.
Yeah, we definitely need to add them. Were those siblings names I already had or that I didn't have? Hopefully that I didn't know about.
I think they're on that document I sent a few
Okay.
months ago, but I'll resend it to you later today.
Yeah, I probably got it. I just can't remember. But anyway, yeah, as I said, it's a work in progress.
Right.
Thank you all very much. And if there is anyone watching this presentation, you can reach out to any one of us at our different institutions. Connect at florencealmuseums.com might be an easy way to get a hold of me, and I can direct you to the other people on the panel, or interacting with us on social media or through our website is an option as well. If you do have any information that you want to follow up with somebody on, and I'd be happy to direct you to Kristina, Chari, or Lee. But I just want to say thank you. This has been a pleasure, and I hope you had as much fun doing this presentation and getting to know everyone as I did. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
This was
Thank
great. Maybe we'll do a follow-up in 6 months.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, you
Thanks,
guys.
guys. Awesome.